Rabbi and Cantor. Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav once said the famous words, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar ma'od, va'ikar lo lefachad klal. The whole world is a narrow bridge, but the most important thing is not to be afraid. There stands a bridge along the U.S. Route 80 that spans the dark waters of the Alabama River. Only 365 meters long, the bridge was a flashpoint for the events of Bloody Sunday in 1965, where non-violent civil rights marchers were brutally attacked by Alabama state troopers, who so vehemently denied not only their rights, but also their very existence. Chief among this group of marchers was future Congressman John Lewis. Only 25 years young at the time, John had already made a name for himself as a prominent leader of the civil rights movement. Mr. Lewis was beaten and trampled by state officials on that day 55 years ago. Lewis's skull was fractured, but he escaped across the bridge to Brown Chapel, and Lewis bore the scars on his head from that incident for the rest of his life. How narrow that bridge must have felt to Mr. Lewis and the other protesters each time they attempted to cross that bridge. Since Lewis's death 4 weeks ago, I have been captivated by his lifelong commitments to civil rights and his work as an activist. Before his funeral, we watched as his body crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge one last time. A horse-drawn caisson led the flag-draped casket of Congressman Lewis from the nearby Brown Chapel AME Church over the bridge, with rose petals scattered on the asphalt. And as Congresswoman Terry Sewell put it, in an act of poetic justice, a line of Alabama state troopers saluted the man whom their predecessors bloodied on that very ground 55 years earlier. John Lewis was a true hero of humankind. In his 80 years of life, he protested over 1,000 times. He was arrested nearly 50 times and fought as a member of the U.S. Congress for the last 33 years of his life. He was driven by a burning sense of justice, a deep-seated belief in God, and an unyielding hunger for righteous action. In this week's Parsha, Ekev, in this week's Parsha Re'eh, as the children of Israel continue to be instructed by Moses on the importance of observing God's will, a dramatic scene is set. See, this day I set before you a blessing and a curse. Blessing if you obey the commandments of Adonai, your God, that I adjoin upon you this day, and a curse if you do not obey the commandments of Adonai, your God, but turn away from the path that I enjoin upon you this day, and follow other gods, whom you have not experienced. Put differently, Moses seems to say, you can live a life of blessing or a life of curses. It is your choice, and you must decide. In other words, the free will that is given to the people to choose the path of blessing and goodness is plainly spoken here. And as our sages have taught, it has remained a central tenet of Jewish observance throughout the ages. Everything is in the hands of heaven, but the fear of heaven. God knows all, and yet we still must choose to observe in human terms. We might say that God wants us to choose to be in a relationship, to want to show our love and devotion, and not to do so out of some robotic sense of devotion or duty or even commandedness, but because we willingly and repeatedly choose to live with righteousness. This concept is fundamental to Judaism throughout time. We choose to do good, and we choose to do evil. The power of choosing has always been in our hands. And as our calendar nears September, how can we not think of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, fast approaching, when we'll be called upon to take stock of the choices we have made in this past year. Have we provided more blessings or more curses? How do the scales of justice look in our own eyes? And how can we use this time to tip the scales towards goodness, towards justice, towards blessing, and towards peace? Perhaps this year, one fraught with so many challenges and spiritually draining experiences, we can look to the John Lewises of the world as role models and modern-day prophets. By emulating his commitments and actions, we can tip our scales. There are hundreds of stories to recall about the life of John Lewis that demonstrate not only his bravery and courage, but also his profound sense of faith and humility. On August 28, 1963, a then 23-year-old John Lewis stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as one of the Big Six organizers of the March on Washington. And John Lewis said, "We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. We come here today with a great sense of misgiving." Lewis continues to speak about the need for equal protection under the law for all people, and in particular for communities of color in the South. And Lewis concludes his speech with these words: "By the force of our demands, our determination, and our numbers, we shall splinter the segregated South in 1,000 pieces and put them together in the image of God and democracy. We must say, wake up, for we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient." How much so do these words ring true today? We must ask ourselves, have we fully woken up? Have we witnessed the long arc of the moral universe bend further towards justice in recent years? We've come a long way since John Lewis spoke those words, but the work is far from finished. Lewis urged us all to answer the highest calling of our hearts and stand up for what we truly believe in. And in his life, he did all he could to demonstrate his beliefs. Parshat Re'eh states, "Do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman." The notion of a hardened heart is a deliberate echo of the Exodus story itself, where Pharaoh infamously hardened his heart to the sufferings of the enslaved Israelites. Our obligation to remember the Exodus, that we were once strangers in a strange land, is so central to Jewish identity that it is the mitzvah most repeated in the entire Torah. Together, Moses and God implore the people to listen, to choose Torah for themselves, and in so choosing, to care for others, especially those most in need. In a 2014 commencement speech at Emory University, John Lewis remembered his friend and fellow civil rights giant, saying that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to get in the way, to get into trouble. He then encouraged those in attendance that you must always find a way to get in the way. You must find a way to get into trouble. And then he adds the caveat, good trouble, necessary trouble. What wonderful words to be remembered for speaking. Getting into good trouble is a message that all of us can take to heart. It is a call to action. It is a message that is reinforced by our Jewish tradition. When the prophet Micah asks, "What does the Lord require of you?" To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Our Jewish values demand of us to get into good trouble for the sake of repairing the world. As we read next week in Parshat Shoftim, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. It is perhaps no coincidence that in the first Torah reading of Elul, we read these words, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, which require both deep and truthful reflection on that which is good, as well as action against injustice and discrimination. Our sacred text and faith tradition offers us a framework on how to make the world a better place. And individuals like John Lewis demonstrated how to manifest those teachings into our everyday lives. Individuals like Abraham Joshua Heschel, who walked together with John Lewis and Dr. King along the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Praying with his legs, Heschel carried with him the wisdom of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, that the whole world is a very narrow bridge. I was shaken and angered to learn that at its construction in 1940, this iconic bridge in Selma was named after a former Confederate general who was later elected a U.S. Senator and became Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. But John Lewis has taught us that just because the bridge may be narrow or named after a narrow-minded person, we are still called upon to cross that bridge. We can help honor the memory of John Lewis by working to wipe out the memory of the hate-filled Klansmen whose name currently adorns this iconic bridge. We can take a small step by educating ourselves and supporting the John Lewis Bridge Project. It is an organized effort to rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge in honor of John Lewis. So after Shabbat, you can do your very small part by going to johnlewisbridge.com and committing your name to the petition. Again, that's johnlewisbridge.com. The final story I wish to share is perhaps the most extraordinary. Not for what happened at the time, but for what took place 48 years later. In May of 1961, a 21-year-old John Lewis and 12 Freedom Riders left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus headed to New Orleans. They sat together on the bus, purposefully integrated, planning to test a Supreme Court ruling of the United States that made segregation and interstate transportation illegal. The Freedom Riders rode safely through Virginia and North Carolina, but experienced some violence when they stopped at the bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Lewis and 2 other Freedom Riders were beaten and bloodied by a gang of young white men before a police officer, who had been present the entire time, finally intervened. The Freedom Riders responded with nonviolence and decided not to press charges, continuing their protest ride further south. And now we flash forward to 2009. 48 years later, an older white man and his son walk into the Capitol Hill office of Georgia Congressman John Lewis. The man, roughly the same age of the congressman at the time, introduced himself. "I am Elwyn Wilson," the man said. "I am one of the men who beat you in Rock Hill, back when I belonged to the KKK. I've come to seek your forgiveness." And without hesitation, Lewis forgave him. Then the congressman recalls that Mr. Wilson started crying, his son started crying, and I started crying. And then we talked. Of that experience, John Lewis comments that Elwyn Wilson told me that he wanted to be right when he met his maker, and I believe he accomplished what he set out to do. He was the very, very first person to come and apologize to me. John Lewis told the South Carolina's Rock Creek Herald for its obituary of Wilson. Forgiveness was more than an action for John Lewis. It was a way of life. Nonviolence and forgiveness was his personal philosophy. As Lewis said himself, we are taught not to hate, not to become bitter, but to believe in the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence, in the way of peace, in the way of love, the way of forgiveness and reconciliation. As we begin the work of Teshuvah in Elul, May we continue to be mindful of the philosophy of nonviolence and forgiveness as John Lewis demonstrated throughout his life. As we approach the end of this year and the beginning of the new year, may we choose blessings and not curses, seek justice, and walk the paths of dignity and peace. Shabbat Shalom.